Very good. Well, I'm going to get started now. Thank you all. Good afternoon. Welcome to today's Pensions and Lifetime Savings Association webinar, where we're going to focus on support for and communication with employers in this time of economic disruption. Today's webinar is the second in our week-long LA Live series. My name is Rachel Pine, and I look after content for the PLSA's conferences and training offerings. Of course, this is the time of the year when we're usually all together, 400 strong, in the Cotswolds for our annual local authority conference. While we were very sad that we weren't able to hold this year's conference, we're making every effort to support the LGPS community with this week's webinar series, along with an enhanced policy update, which I'll tell you more about later. Our topics this week include regulation, ESG with a focus on climate, and the launch of the Scheme Advisory Board's annual report with a special opportunity for LA funds to ask questions of the board's chair and practitioner representative. We also have a webinar on administration. Now, yesterday's webinar looked at how the pandemic is impacting the LGPS and the pension regulators' response to that impact. More than half of the questions we received yesterday were about employers who may be facing financial difficulties, furloughing employees, or employers who would like to defer payments. So I'm especially pleased that our panelists today can talk us through these and other issues specific to LGPS Tier 3 employers. Joining us today are John Raisin, who has deep experience in the LGPS as the independent chair of Merseyside's Pension Fund Board, advisor to Nottinghamshire's Pension Board, and independent governance and investment advisor to Waltham Forest, Haringey, and Barking and Dagenham. He was also a chief officer in various LAs for more than 20 years. We also have Emelda Nicholroy, who is the head of pensions policy at the University and College Employers Association, which is the trade body for higher education institutions. Emelda is the education employer representative on the LGPS Scheme Advisory Board and the higher education employer representative on the Teachers Pension Scheme Advisory Board. So we're in two very safe pairs of hands for this discussion. But first, I have a polling question for all of you. It's going to pop up on your screen. So the question is, have any administering authorities had any requests at all for payment deferrals due to the COVID pandemic? Okay, it looks like everyone's got their votes in, and seems so 31% say no, informal discussions 22%, formal requests also 22%, and not sure 24%. So it looks like, if you can all see these now, it looks like it's kind of across the board, almost even, slightly biased towards no. So we'll take that down now. This will be available later. And good place to start our conversation. So I'm going to turn this over to our first speaker now, John Raisin. Welcome, John.
Hi. You said to me to talk about what are tier 3s. Well, I think hopefully we all know what a tier 3 employer is, but essentially it is both a scheduled and an admitted body that doesn't have a benefit of a local or national taxpayer backing. I think it's important to remember that there are scheduled bodies in that, because sometimes people just think of the admitted bodies, and the scheduled bodies are extremely important. In terms of what numbers are there, well, I think the Aon report is quite difficult to find out how many tier 3s there are, because clearly the number of employers changes. But if you look at the Aon report they did for SAB back in 2018, they estimated at that time about 1,750 employers, and that was out of then 15,000. So it was 10 to 15% of employers. In terms of employee numbers, it was about 550,000 out of then 5.8 million. So it was less than 10%. And in terms of liability, it was 27 billion. And that again was probably less than 10% of the liabilities at the time. So it's somewhere around 10% is probably the tier 3. But the question is, which tier 3s are risky and which aren't? Well, again, that will be on a fund by fund basis. But one large fund that I work with did some pretty detailed work, and they thought that probably about 4% of their liabilities fell into a sort of higher risk tier 3 element. So it is quite a big number, because if you think in terms of a London borough with a small fund, that'd be, say, 4% be £40 million. If you're looking at county funds, you're talking probably somewhere between 80 and 400 million of liabilities potentially. And the big Met funds, or, you know, the Strathclyde or somewhere, you're talking 400, 500, 600 million. So we're talking potentially big numbers, whether you're, you know, a London Borough fund at one end, or you're a huge metropolitan fund at the other end. Not all scheduled bodies are strong. That's the really important thing, but some are. Now, I'll not talk about universities because Emelda knows far more those than I do. But if you look at further education colleges, the fact is, it doesn't matter how strong their balance sheet is. Ultimately, they don't have a government guarantee. I mean, the Education Act changed everything, and they are not, you know, a government-backed body. And so we need to bear that in mind with further education colleges. Again, with contractors, hopefully, you know, they have backing through pass-through arrangements. So perhaps contractors are not such an issue, although they can be. Community admission bodies are perhaps a real issue, because some of these have been around for a long time, and where funds haven't done, you know, real covenant work, and I'm not just talking about, you know, relying on the actuary, because the actuaries do a wonderful job, and we all know the actuaries do a fantastic job, but some funds, you know, just rely on the actuary to do everything. If you haven't done work over and above the actuary's basic work, there may be questions about community admission bodies. So I think that, you know, it's a very sort of broad group here that we're talking about, and within each group there is a broad range of issues. So what should we be doing with employers? Now, I think there's three issues. One is communication, one is what happens if there's a deferral approach, and the other is the whole issue of covenants. I'm not going to talk about covenants now, perhaps we'll come back to those. But I mean, in terms of communication, I think, you know, normal communication with employees is absolutely essential. They need to be clear, they need to continue to provide quality data. That's required, you know, on an ongoing basis, for example, new benefit cases. They need to produce the year-end returns, annual benefit statements, etc. They must continue to pay all employee contributions. There is absolutely no reason whatsoever for employee contributions not to be paid. 100% need to be paid on time, no exceptions. And I think the other thing is that each fund should be saying to employers, we expect you to continue to pay your employee contributions on time and in full. There shouldn't be some presumption that people can't do that. I mean, you know, the default scenario is Regulation 67, which says that everything on the rates and adjustment certificate for that year must be paid within the year. So there's no deferral, as far as I can see, unless someone can tell me otherwise, beyond, you know, the end of the financial year. But I think also funds should be saying to employers, if you have a problem, talk to us now, because we do want to avoid the issue where somebody doesn't pay an employer contribution and then you're left with a question of, you know, do we report it to the regulator, etc. I mean, I might stop there. We can talk about, you know, deferral requests perhaps later on, but I'll perhaps stop and hand over to Emelda.
Right, thank you, John. I really wanted to sort of add to what John's been saying and talk about the higher education sector in particular and some of the issues that have been coming up there as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic, and really just to highlight the difficulty in making assessments of employer covenant across an industry without actually drilling down into the issues that are affecting individual employers. So just to start off, obviously higher education employers are part of the tier 3 group. I'm really mainly talking about those post-92 modern universities that are scheduled employers in the LGPS. There are a number of the older pre-92 universities, their admitted bodies and their exposure to the LGPS is much, much smaller. So really I'm going to focus on the post-92s here. So we're talking about somewhere in the region of 4% of the liabilities of the LGPS in England. So in terms of the issues hitting universities, we're seeing short-term issues. So in terms of cash flow, in terms of lost income relating to things like student accommodation or running conferences and catering, things like that. The estimate is that this is potentially up to 18% of the income across the sector, but this will vary massively from institution to institution. In particular, the post-92s tend to get the majority of their income from student fees. Their income isn't as diversified, so these short-term cash flow issues may not hit the post-92s as much as the pre-92s. And then we have longer term issues, particularly the loss of international students, but also the issues of home students in the UK deferring for a year or more. Again, the reliance on international students varies massively from institution to institution, but those institutions that have the greatest proportion of their students coming from overseas are really the pre-92 institutions. Those are the institutions that have, say 50% plus of their students coming from overseas. For the post-92s, the ones that are more important from the LGPS perspective, we're looking at 10, 15, 20%. So a significant proportion of their students, but in no means the majority. So we really do need to understand the local impacts there. There are also issues around the deferral of UK students, but that there is a much lower likelihood of that. The recent estimates and sort of surveys of students have suggested that perhaps 16% of UK students are considering deferring, but there's a huge amount of uncertainty there. Obviously, we have those students that might ordinarily take a gap year, but with the issues around international travel, would they be able to do that? If they're looking at taking work experience or internships, will that be available? There might be students that wish to retake their A-levels if they don't feel that the changes that have been made to the assessment process have given them the result that they were expecting or the result that they would like. So these issues affect institution by institution very differently. There are also questions that need to be asked. So, for example, that we tend to see in times of recession, when jobs are less available, that more people would go into full-time higher education. So if we see the next academic year being a period of recession, we could actually see more students wanting to come in. But conversely, we tend to see a fall in part-time students because they would normally or quite often look at getting jobs in order to finance their studies. And if those jobs aren't available, then we might see a fall in part-time students. So you'd need to understand from an institution perspective, are they highly reliant on part-time students versus full-time students? And again, that will differ hugely from institution to institution. There is, however, a huge amount of support coming through for institutions. They're eligible for the job retention scheme. It applies slightly differently because they are, in part at least, publicly funded. So the government's position is that staff can be furloughed if they are unable to work due to the coronavirus. So for example, when a campus has been shut, you could look at furloughing hospitality staff or estate staff or cleaners, people like that. But the number of staff can only be furloughed up to the proportion of non-public funding that an institution receives. So if, for example, they can say that 40% of their funding comes from non-public sources, and we are counting tuition fees as a public source of funding. So if they had, say, 40% of their funding come from non-public sources, they could look at furloughing up to 40% of their pay bill, as long as those staff met the criteria for being furloughed. Universities are also able to use the government's loan and financing schemes, and there are a number of HE-specific issues that have been tackled. So in particular, we have temporary student number controls for the next academic year, and a limit on unconditional offers. This is really to stop institutions poaching each other's students. So there's a cap on student numbers that says you can't recruit more than 5% above the numbers that you had in the previous year. That should help to stabilise student numbers across the piece. There's also going to be enhancements to clearing to give students more information and better flexibility. That might mean that students make choices later than they would ordinarily. So there might be a delay in terms of an institution knowing the students that they have coming for the next academic year. And a very key proposal by the government is to shore up cash flow of institutions by bringing forward tuition fee payments to September for next academic year. So the institutions would get their payment much earlier on than they would. And then obviously it's down to the institution to manage their cash flow for the rest of the year to ensure that that doesn't create further issues down the line. And that does tackle one of the biggest issues, which at the moment, which is short-term cash flow. So there are a number of areas where universities are being supported by the government. There are also things that universities are doing individually to look at, particularly at cutting costs, at managing their spending. A number of institutions have announced things like pay freezes or cuts in pay, particularly for senior staff. They are also having recruitment freezes, stopping employing temporary staff, things like that. And there are a number of universities that have announced significant job losses. So this is something that we are keeping an eye on. But again, with a focus on the post-92s, those institutions do tend to spend more of their income on staff. So these kind of measures would look at managing their expenditure very quickly to stabilise and shore up the institution. Universities are also clearly doing a lot of future planning and perhaps seeing this as a transition period to a new normal. There's a regulatory requirement for universities to maintain teaching, maintain the quality of that teaching, and also to maintain their awarding of qualifications. If they don't do that, they have to report to the Office of Students, the regulator of higher education. And so a lot of institutions have transferred their teaching online, as many schools have done. It's up to the institution when they reopen their campus. There's a possibility that some may open things like labs in say June, but main campuses might not open for students until September, until the new academic year. Some are looking at having a virtual term for the first term. Some are looking at deferring the start of the year until January. So they are trying to manage this, and they're trying to provide the best education for their students that they can. And some of this has led to business restructuring, looking at shutting down courses, looking at maintaining their online presence. This may well have been something they were looking at doing anyway, and this has just sped up the process for them. So there are a number of things that universities are doing in order to become more efficient and stabilise the sector in the coming academic year. I think my comment overall would be that this does seem to be very much a short-term issue, particularly in terms of cash flow for universities. If you're actually looking at the long-term strength of employer covenant, there are a number of uncertainties out there, but I think in many cases this will not significantly damage the long-term covenant. It really is a short-term issue. The government has said that if individual institutions are struggling, they need to show really that as a last resort, they are coming to the government for further support, and that the government would look at this on a case-by-case basis, and it would come with conditions attached. So it could mean things like future mergers, things like that. At the moment, we have no sense that any institutions are particularly at this point. They are managing things individually and locally. But I do think that institutions will start looking at pension costs as well as staff costs in terms of salaries. I know that they are aware that there is the ability to defer within the year their LGPS contributions. So it wouldn't surprise me if institutions do start coming and talking to their funds. We would always encourage them to talk to their funds as early as possible in these scenarios, to include their funds in the discussions that are taking place locally. So I absolutely agree with John that that communication and engagement in these times is absolutely key, and we would encourage both funds and employers to engage with that. So I think I will stop there. I'm very happy to take any questions.
Fantastic. Thanks, Emelda. It was very thorough. From my perspective, in a bad economy, it's great to go get another degree. Just keep your head down and study for a couple of years, and maybe it'll be better when you come out. So maybe my statement today will help the university sector. But however, so thank you for that. John, I have a question for you just to start. I'm using my chair's prerogative, and then we are getting some good and tricky questions from the audience. We've all been following the LGPS Good Governance Project carefully. Of course, it was meant to be complete now, but it's been delayed a bit. Does the LGPS Good Governance Project have any relevance for the COVID pandemic? What can we learn from it?
I think it absolutely does. I mean, I think the LGPS Good Governance Project is the most important thing happening in the LGPS. I don't think there's anything more important than it. I sometimes get tired of hearing about investment pooling because I think there's far too much emphasis on that and not enough on good governance. I think the fact is that the good governance project is exactly what it says, good governance. And when that is actually implemented, and I was fortunate enough to be on both the working parties on phase 2 and I'm on the phase 3 implementation group. There are issues in there, for example, to ensure adequate resourcing. And there needs to be business planning, there needs to be a budget and adequate resourcing. There's also provisions in there that administering authorities, HR, look at pensions separately and not just as a council function. And there's also this requirement of the LGPS senior officer. So I think all that is important, because going forward, if LGPS funds want to be here long-term, local funds, those of us who believe in a locally managed LGPS, which I do, need to make sure that funds are robustly resourced, and they're not all robustly resourced. I mean, one of the reasons that I ultimately left local government was because I felt, and it wasn't the last employer I had actually, it was the previous one, but it sort of led me along the route I've got at the moment. People don't always, and senior council officers don't always realise about the LGPS. They think it's some sort of adjunct, something stuck on the side. They don't realise the value of the assets, the liabilities, the numbers of people, the employers. So yes, this project's absolutely crucial, because this should be used by LGPS funds to say, actually, we need to be properly resourced, because there are a lot of them are not properly resourced, in my opinion, and they only survive because the officers are absolutely heroic. And this is true. I could name people, I'm not going to, because for every one I name, there's probably 5 others I don't know, who are doing unbelievable jobs. And the LGPS in some places only survives because some officers just give their all. And that isn't actually how it should be. So yes, it's absolutely crucial. And the quicker it's implemented, the better.
Very good, thanks. Emelda, did you want to add to that?
Yes, just to say, from a scheme advisory board perspective, this is still very much on our radar. It's just been paused, really. The implementation group has been paused, particularly to give local authorities some breathing space, because they're focused on other activities at the moment. But absolutely, we'll be picking this up as soon as we can.
Right. So now we're getting quite a lot of questions. This is great. So should admitted employers opt in due course to make larger numbers of older staff, perhaps take early retirement? What impact would this have on funds? For example, lower employee contributions and or higher cessation costs. So I don't know which of you would like to jump in there.
Well, that's an interesting one. So when we say encourage them to take their benefits now, it depends what you mean by that, doesn't it? Because if people are going to be encouraged to take their benefits early, at their own cost with reduced actuarial values, and take a lower pension now, i.e. leave the employer somehow voluntarily, are people really going to do that? I question that. So, I mean, if people want to make people, redundant post 55, then they'll have to pay the strain costs and the full pension to the people, etc., etc. So, I think on the employers, it would be extremely expensive for them. As for funds, yes, it would make the funds more mature, but actually, I think the boot's on the employer there, because if they want to go along that line, in effect, they're going to have to pay very heavily for it. And I would have thought that if employers are cash strapped, that they wouldn't want to be going along, making people redundant unless they had to. But of course, a lot of people are under 55, aren't they now? So they can just make people redundant and they're deferred. And if you're deferred, of course, you don't pay in, but you don't get anything out perhaps for many years. But it depends who ends up being redundant, over 55s, under 55s.
Absolutely. I was just going to say that what I've heard from our employers is, obviously there are some employers that are looking at making staff redundant. That's always a last resort, and employers would always want to aim for voluntary redundancies rather than compulsory. But there are also other employers that are very cautious about using things like the furloughing scheme, because they don't want to accidentally trigger redundancy by reducing people's hours or salaries and accidentally triggering particularly those that are over 55 in the LGPS, where there is a significant strain cost. That's something that employers are very aware of, and they're also aware of trying to monitor. Certainly from a university perspective, there are a number of different DB schemes that are on offer in the sector. And so employers are making sure that they know who is in the schemes and their ages, and they know the profile of staff, so that they don't accidentally trigger a Section 75 debt if they have no active members left. That's something that our employers are becoming exceedingly aware of in terms of understanding the impact of their staffing issues on their pension fund and the costs. Because for these DB schemes, the cost is really going up and up, and in the main it falls on the employer.
Interesting. So thank you for that. So a question for Emelda. Do you think the higher education, further education sector will now be looking to the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government to take forward the flexibilities in the LGPS regulations, for example, to permit them to stop admitting new members?
Yeah, thank you. I was anticipating a question like this. I think it will have to be taken forward. My employers are definitely asking about it and trying to understand where this consultation has gone. My understanding is that the response to the consultation has been significantly delayed. We would hope to hear something in the autumn, but obviously that will depend on the situation with the pandemic. This isn't a high priority, certainly, for the government at the moment. But from a HE employer perspective, particularly those institutions where staff costs are the majority of their expenditure, they will need to be looking at the spend on their pension schemes. And so the drive for greater flexibility is something that our employers are really, they would really like to see. That's not to say that the majority of them would even want to exercise that flexibility. They would just like to have the ability to say, to move from scheduled to admitted, and then that gives them a sort of starting point for a conversation with their fund. The employers that have kind of engaged in these discussions, they fully understand that there may well be cost implications to the employer of reducing the number of active members that they have in the fund if they close it to new entrants, for example. But what they want is the ability to have these discussions. And so we have had employers come to us and say, we're reviewing everything. We're reviewing our entire cost base. We also want to review our pension provision. Can you tell me what's going on with this consultation? In the meantime, what we're seeing is that there are some universities that are setting up wholly owned subsidiaries and using those subsidiaries to employ staff, because that means that they are not eligible for the LGPS. And that is what is actually happening while we're waiting to see what these flexibilities mean. And that is a much bigger issue. I personally think if there was flexibility under the LGPS regulations that would allow these members of staff to remain employed by the university, that would be a benefit to the employers, to the members and to the funds, rather than them having to use this subsidiary route. But we'll wait and see. I mean, we are constantly asking about where this consultation is, and we would hope to hear something in the autumn.
Very good. Question on charities has come in, and we discussed this in our briefing call, but we haven't talked about it too much today. So longstanding CABs that are charities are often treated more harshly on cessation than TABs. And the person goes on to say, one I'm working with joined in 1986 with a 5-clause admission agreement, and secession was not even thought of. Another has a bill out of the blue for $300K. But really, I think overall, the point here is surely more should be done for the sector. Shouldn't more be done for the sector at a time when charitable giving is low and funds are very stressed? So I don't know which of you, and if you could explain what CAB and TAB are in your answer so that everyone will know. Yeah,
I mean, it's a bit old terminology now, actually, I think, under the present regs, but community admission bodies, such as a charity, who it's something providing a similar service to a local authority locally. That was generally a community admission body. Whereas a transferee admission body is basically a contractor, someone taking over the function of a tier 1 or tier 2 employer, so either primarily a council or an academy school. I've got some sympathy, I have to say, with long-standing CABs who get into trouble through no fault of their own. And why do I say that? Because I think that administering authorities should have been looking at this issue long ago, and some have been. And this all goes back to good governance and proper resourcing, and whether an LGPS fund is properly resourced. Because if an LGPS fund was properly resourced and thought about it, and didn't rely on the actuary to think about employer covenants, and actually did some proactive work, which many do, but some don't because they're not resourced to do so, and they do need to be resourced, that they would have been thinking about this long ago. And I think there are two obvious routes. One is if the CAB has assets, putting a charge over those assets. Now some do have their own property, do have buildings, etc. Some of them in quite valuable places. That's one line. The second line is if that body does have a close relationship with a local authority, or does something which is very important locally, is there a possibility the local authority would act as the backstop to it? And I think those are two approaches which should have been looked at long ago. But the truth is, when an administrative authority looks at the CAB or anyone else, the primary duty of the fund is to the fund and to all the employers as a whole. So, you can't sort of look at the employer in isolation. The employer, in a sense, you're here to protect the fund as an administrative authority and the other employers. That's why, at the moment about deferrals, one of my comments would be, if you're looking at the deferral of payments, the first thing you need to think about is what's in the best interest of the fund, and secondly, what's in the best interest of all of the employees in the fund as a whole. In a sense, the individual who's come and asked for it is only third in my view. So, that would be my thought on it.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. I completely agree that these are, I guess, bodies that have been slightly forgotten in terms of some of the conversations that have been taking place on the LGPS. And it's been known for a very long time that these sort of charities are in a position where they can't afford to be in the scheme, but they also can't afford to leave. I do think something has to be done in terms of perhaps giving them a more flexible exit, so that absolutely the fund's exposure is managed and the exposure of the other employers is managed while maintaining the benefit entitlement of their members. I think at this point in time, the issue is really going to be that charities are affected in variable ways. You might have one charity that's providing, support for care homes where their services are in high demand and will be being well funded by the local authority. And you might have another charity that provides a very similar service, but it's in the home. So they are unable to provide their service during this time of pandemic because they can't do that with social distancing. So you need to understand a bit more about what services these charities provide and how it's being funded. And really, I guess, engage on an individual level. But I absolutely think that this is a group that needs to be engaged and managed over the longer term, just to manage the risks that the LGPS itself, the funds, are exposed to, as well as the risks to the employer. I can't imagine that employer that had a bill for £300,000 was very happy about that. And I would imagine for some charities that would push them over the edge. They would cease to function if they had that sort of bill. So yeah, I think these issues just really need to be tackled. I mean, that was one of the drivers behind the Tier 3 project when it was set up quite a while ago.
Right. Really, really interesting stuff. And then just an overarching question. So we had a webinar yesterday with the LGA and the regulator, and we were discussing how various aspects of the scheme are coping with COVID. We asked people if they thought that their cash flow would be a problem by the end of this year. 37% said that cash flow could become difficult. Additional 4% said they expected a significant issue by year's end. Do these numbers, do they sound right to you?
Without knowing exactly who responded, it's difficult. What I would say is that I would have thought that for those funds who are cash flow positive in terms of employer and employee contributions coming in, the benefits being paid out, the vast majority of those shouldn't be too affected by COVID. And why do I say that? Well, most Tier 1 employers and employees' contributions should be secure. Now, I'll come to district councils and leisure in a minute, because it is an issue, but I think it's not a big issue. And again, with Tier 2 academies, And, you know, there is a significant element of tier 3, which is secure. So if you are a fairly cash flow positive fund in terms of employer and employee contributions over benefits out, I can't see too much of a difficulty, assuming that, you know, COVID is sorted by sometime, you know, the beginning of next financial year. Where there is a bit more of an issue, I think, is those who are negative, i.e. benefits paid out exceed employer and employee contributions and were always expected to do so. And then they are reliant on investment income. And again, you know, it depends on the nature of their investment income and how secure that is. You know, if they were relying on, you know, equity dividend income, which I doubt many people were, they might have a bit of a problem. But even where people's, you know, investment income, if you look at the account, says X, it might well be that they were never drawing all the income they could have drawn, because, you know, it's not uncommon on the investment side for people to take the income and just reinvest it. So I wouldn't be too worried myself in the short term. But it does depend going forward about how investment returns are effective, and particularly income. And that's why so many funds have been thinking recently, which has been good thinking, about how they can, you know, increase their income, as opposed to simply growing their fund in terms of assets.
Right.
I agree. I think it would be interesting to know the kind of context within which the people that were answering that question. You know, are they talking about employers wanting to defer contributions, for example? I would say that I absolutely agree with John. I think the vast majority of the contributions that are coming in from employers are secure into the LGPS. It would be a small minority of employers that would request deferrals, and a proportion of those where that would be agreed. And then it's very clear under the regulations that those payments need to be made good by the end of the financial year. I think if you get into a position where an employer has not met that duty and so hasn't made the payment by the end of the financial year, then it's probably a situation where that employer is in significant difficulties. It's not that they're trying to shirk their duties, and that then has much wider repercussions for the LGPS, even though we're probably talking about a very small proportion of the liabilities. But I would say in those scenarios, cash flow is probably only one of the issues that the LGPS will need to consider.
So we've got one more question. Oh, sorry, John, did you want to add something?
Yeah, I mean, I think Emelda's absolutely right to refer to Regulation 67, because I think every employer needs to read Regulation 67 if they're thinking about deferrals, because it's quite clear, and there's no ifs and buts as far as I can see Regulation 67, unless someone can tell me I've read it wrongly, but it says what senior rates and adjustment certificates for that year must be paid in that year. So if there's a deferral, it's only within the year. And if you get to a position where someone's saying, well, I can't pay it this year, etc., you should be really worried there's something big going on long term. And the fact is that, you know, the LGPS is not a bank, it is not a provider of credit, and any deferral needs to be, you know, as a last resort, and needs to look at, you know, cash flows and balance sheets and liquid assets and, you know, fixed assets, and can you take charges, etc. This is not some sort of soft option, and it needs to be made clear to employers, in my opinion, that it isn't a soft option. It's a last resort, but it's a last resort so long as the employer is, you know, solvent. It has to be done, as I said, first of all, in the interest of the fund and all employers. We are not here, when I say we, I'm talking about an administering authority, to bail out any employer. We can't do it. And in fact, pushing someone's employer contributions back in itself isn't going to save an organisation if it's so fundamentally flawed. So it's got to be looked at in the round. So there may be cases where you can defer, and I think Emelda, you know, we can talk about this more, is where there'll be big sums coming in to some higher education organisations later this year. And we know they're coming in, so you could take that into account. But if you've not hard evidence that this is just a temporary situation, then you've got to think long and hard about how much, you know, discretion you apply.
Right. Absolutely. I mean, yeah, I do actually, you know, I would say this, but I do think that that it's the education establishments that perhaps have a reasonable case for deferral, because their financial year is slightly skewed from that of the administering authority, and for them making payments at the beginning of their financial year, which would tend to be from the 1st of August, and particularly in this year when they were expecting their tuition fees to be paid earlier than normal in September, that they can demonstrate that they would have an income stream that is guaranteed. It's coming from the government. So that could be a very strong case for allowing a deferral. But I completely agree that I think that there might be some employers that would see this as a kind of saving grace for them. But deferring for a few months, if you're really in trouble, is not going to be something that is going to save your organisation, and it does involve the fund having to do a significant level of due diligence to ensure that they're making the right decision on behalf of the fund.
Right. So I've got one last very quick question for you. You each have 30 seconds to answer it. We'll start with Emelda. Top tips that you give people listening today for dealing with employers. What questions should they be asking? What should they be doing?
Oh, crikey. I think communicate. I know that there is frustration out there amongst administering authorities that employers do not always respond. There are forums held where employers don't turn up and all sorts of things. But please don't stop. It also does help organisations like ourselves to engage with our employers, so we can try and hit them with a sort of double whammy, and try and get through to the right person in the organisation. I think that's another key one, is trying to understand exactly the person that you're communicating with. Perhaps going through the pension manager isn't the best way to engage in the organisation. Maybe you need to get hold of the finance director, or even go right up to the vice chancellor. So yeah, please try and communicate. Please try and get in at the right level of the organisation, and please keep up the good work and keep doing what you're doing.
Thank you. And John, 30-second answer.
Think about Regulation 67. It's crucial. I think look at the FAQs on the LGPS website, and it's this whole issue that remember it's the fund and all employers in general is your first concern. And the second concern is that employer. Going forward, I think it's this whole issue that all funds should be looking at covenants going forward, as we move towards the next valuation in Scotland of honours, and the next valuation in 2 years away. But should we look at employer covenants now and thinking about how you treat employers going forward in the next rates and adjustment certificate? And there are real questions I think about. Do you have different investment strategies? Some funds already have them. Do you put some of the employers into tier 3 into a less risky investment strategy, reduce their contribution periods, increase their contribution rates? You might say, well, that's counterintuitive, but actually, if you want to actually make sure they can actually pay off their debts, as long as they, essentially solvent, the quicker the better, in my view. And I think that's the way some of the better resourced funds have moved already into doing that.
Great, fantastic. Well, thank you both. We don't have any more time for questions, but for now, I'd like to thank Emelda and John for joining us today, and to thank my colleagues Rebecca Mosel and Ellie Halls, who do an amazing job with the technology to keep this all running. And thank you all for joining us today to watch the webinar. We hope that we'll be able to see you in Gloucestershire next year, and hopefully before then. Thanks so much.